Good morning, honors writing students, otherwise known as Advanced Placement Language and Composition. We're going to start off today with a pretty lengthy lecture. I apologize for the long-windedness of this, but we do need to discuss some basic topics that we'll be discussing throughout the semester to give you some terminology so that you'll understand what's going on. When we read our pieces of nonfiction, we're going to be responding to those in writing and hopefully with verbal responses also that you'll be giving. But we need to understand some of the basic concepts of rhetoric, and rhetoric is the effective use of persuasive language, and all language in some sense is persuasive, but when we talk about rhetoric, we're particularly talking about the strategies that writers use to convey a message and to get across those persuasive messages. And in order to do that, to analyze for rhetoric, we have to think about what the rhetorical situation is, and every communication situation has these basic components. And we know that there is the writer, that's you. That's the person who has written the piece, or if you're the reader, that would be you analyzing something by a particular writer. The audience. The audience is the people who are ideally going to be reading the piece of writing. We don't know exactly who that audience is in most cases. Sometimes we have a good sense of our audience. Sometimes it's really not very clear who is going to be reading our writing. We can never really be sure unless we're given a specific audience. But audience is also a concept that involves a role that the reader or the listener chooses to step into. So it's not just like the writer or the speaker sort of pandering to a particular audience, but with the understanding that when the audience enters that room, that they're going to be arriving with a particular mindset to receive this message that the writer is delivering. The topic, so the information that we're trying to get across. What are we talking about? What is the message, the information that we're trying to deliver? And then the purpose, and purpose is really, really important. Without purpose, there's no point in writing. There's no point in speaking. And purpose involves some pretty specific things. Sometimes we hear purpose being described as, to entertain, to teach, to express an idea, those kinds of things. But I think we need to take purpose a lot more, a lot deeper than what we normally think of with purpose. Purpose for this class and for, hopefully writing assignments that you'll do later on, focuses on something very specific, and that is what do you want your audience to do? Not what do you want them to think, but what do you want them to actually do? Because the thinking process is hopefully just a precursor to getting your audience to take some sort of specific action. Do you want them to vote for a particular candidate? Do you want them to buy a specific product? Do you want them to stop smoking? Do you want them to wear a mask and take precautions in an age of a pandemic? What is it that you want these people to do? What you don't want is for your audience to pick up your reading and read it, and then after they've finished reading it, look at you and say, that's nice, and give you a little sort of condescending pat on the back and say, good job, honey, you're a good writer, let's move on. That's not what writing is all about. It's not about sort of boosting our egos and making us feel good about our writing. It's about really getting our audience to actually do something. So I really want us to start focusing on that particular aspect of purpose. And I want you to think about that as you're analyzing other pieces of writing too. Think about what is it that this writer is trying to get me to do, and that could be multiple things. It couldn't, it's not just if I can accomplish this one thing, then I've achieved my goal. But usually good writing and complex writing has more than one purpose, and so we're going to be discussing the the particulars of those kinds of purposes as we move through the readings that we do for this class. All right, so we see this. Those are the four basic components. And then surrounding that is the context in which you write, and that is the physical context, what's going on, the historical context. And when we see pieces by authors such as Langston Hughes, who wrote in the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote during an age of oppression for African Americans, much more so than what we see today. What is Langston Hughes trying to get us to do? And think about the context in which he wrote. If we don't think about context, then we try to apply our 21st century middle class, our own situations to the writer. And so we have to think about what the writer's physical context is. What is the historical context? What is the social and cultural context? And then so that brings us to this piece here, the culture in which you write. You can imagine somebody who wrote a piece during the Civil War, and if you didn't know that piece took place during the Civil War, then you might just gauge it based on today's standards, by your own personal standards, and we really need to step out of that role as critical readers in order to understand what we're doing and to make much more sense of what we're reading. So let's move on here. A rhetorical situation. That's what we just saw at the beginning, but there's in speech communication classes, sometimes that's perceived in a slightly different way. It's often described as the sender, the receiver, the medium, and the message. And so we'll just take a look at these. The sender is anyone who is delivering the message. That would be a speaker, a writer, a signaler, someone who's doing sign language. If somebody's sending smoke signals, if somebody's sending a text, somebody is initiating a communication in any way. It could be through body language. It could be through even some clothing that you're wearing. You're sending off a particular message. So who is this person who is sending the message? The sender. And then there's the receiver. We can think of that as the audience, the listener, the reader, the viewer. It could be a person who's watching a movie. It could be a person who's watching a broadcast or listening to a podcast, watching a YouTube video, watching a TikTok. I mean, whatever that person happens to be, those are the receivers, the person or people for whom the message is intended. And of course, that kind of works with what we call the target audience. And I like the use of the word target because a target is made up of sort of concentric circles. It has the bullseye in the middle, and then it has another ring surrounding it, and then a wider ring surrounding it, and so on. And so if we hit our target audience, we are going to also sort of hit, to a lesser extent, other audiences. But let's think about the people or the person for whom the message is intended. And again, sometimes that's very vague. And it really helps you as a speaker or a writer if you know who you're talking to. I was in a situation one time when I had to give a speech, and nobody could tell me whether I was speaking to junior high kids or high school kids or college kids or college professors, and it was very, very frustrating that, or was I speaking to a mixture of all these different people? So gearing a message towards an audience is really important. We need to think about who our audience is. And I often say in my sophomore classes when we're studying Julius Caesar, I repeat this over and over, that the number one rule of rhetoric is to know your audience. If you know your audience, then you can gear that message towards the audience much more effectively. And you have a sense of that from the time you're a little kid, from the time you start asking your parents or your brothers or sisters or your aunts and uncles or whoever, you want something from those people. And so you're going to speak to those people in different ways depending on who they are. You're going to change your tone, you're going to change your message, you're going to change your overall approach depending on who you're gearing that message for. So The receiver, continuing with the receiver, this role can change often during a conversation involving two or more participants. So the sender and the receiver goes back and forth if we have an exchange or like a committee meeting in which a lot of people are speaking sort of back and forth. The medium is the means by which the message is delivered from the sender to the receiver. Face-to-face conversation is a medium. That's why media is what we refer to with TV, radio, um, social media, that sort of thing. That's why we refer to those as the media, because they are the means by which the information is being delivered from the sender to the receiver. The medium could be speaking from a stage, telephone, television, social media, text messaging, radios, letters, books, billboards, sign language, flag signals. If you're if you're an air traffic controller, or if you're somebody who's down on the ground giving directions for planes to land and that sort of thing, you'll use flags. So that's a specific medium. Even gestures and facial expressions, and yes, even silence is a medium. What you don't say is sometimes as important as what you do say. And then, of course, the message. What is the information that is delivered from the sender to the receiver? What are you trying to get across? And of course, purpose is the ultimate goal of all that. So let's move on to rhetorical choices. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that I want us to be conscious of. These are the things that I want you to think about as you're reading the pieces that you have or that you'll be analyzing for this class, and then hopefully later on as you sharpen your skills. But the rhetorical choices involve pretty much this basic concept here: what to say or write and how to say or write it. We have lots and lots of different choices, and a lot of times those are referred to as stylistic choices. Sometimes style and rhetoric can be used interchangeably, although they do have their own unique nuances of meaning. A lot of times when we're talking about rhetoric, we are talking about style. We're talking about the choices that a writer has and how those choices are executed throughout a particular message. And so let's talk about, I like to divide these up into larger units of discourse and smaller units of discourse. So we're talking about, with the larger units of discourse, those are here: the structure, the form, the organization, the arrangement, the order, so the ordering of ideas, the positioning of major ideas in relation to each other. There's kind of a fancy word for that: juxtaposition. You may have heard that word, although a lot of people misuse that term, so I kind of hesitate to throw that out there. But how do you set ideas next to each other to achieve a particular effect? How do you organize your ideas? What do you say first to sort of get your reader's attention, to get your readers acclimated to the message, and how do you put those in a logical progression of ideas? So let's take a look at some of the different modes of discourse, and sometimes these might be referred to as genres. But I prefer to call them modes of discourse at this point. So when you're choosing to write something, there are lots of different ways we can, lots of different forms that your writing can take. And so sometimes in the younger grades, students will say things like, what can you do in a paper? Can you say I in a paper? Can you use a generic you in a paper? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on the type of paper that you're writing. So in this case, a narrative takes place in the form of a story, and those are events and actions in sequence. Okay, so that is pretty self-explanatory. You all have read narrative types of literature before, and there's fictional narrative and there's non-fictional narrative. But if it takes place in the form of a story, we can call it a narrative form. Within these types of forms, we also have others. So these are not mutually exclusive. They all work together. You know that when you're reading a story, very often you will have some descriptions within that story. You'll have examples and illustrations within that story. You will have some cause and effect and some comparisons and contrasts and those sorts of things. These are not mutually exclusive. They do work together. But that's kind of your job in terms of analyzing these pieces that we're going to be reading, as to how you break that down. And so description. Description is really important because it makes your readers feel like they're experiencing an event along with you rather than just hearing about it. Rather than just saying, well, okay, I did this, then I did this, then I went here, and then I did something else. We don't want to make our writing read like a menu that just says, I did one thing, I did another thing, I did another thing. So it's not just a listing, but we break it down and really specify mental pictures that are comprised of colors, shapes, proximity. And proximity means when we're describing something, we describe the distance from one thing to another thing. And imagery, a lot of times we think of it as being visual images, and the visual sense is in a lot of cases the dominant sense. So that's what we like to focus on. But don't forget that we have 4 other senses besides just visual. There are sounds, smells or scents, flavors, textures. How rough or smooth or soft, or how different types of sensations, temperatures. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it what type of a heat or cold is it? And the emotions come into play also, because all these different things cause us to feel different things. And then once we get through all the 5 senses, we also have to consider metaphors and other comparative devices. So you can describe something in terms of what it looks like, and you can describe its appearance. But if you use a metaphor, your writing can be really effective. Try to think about what your audience is familiar with, and then come up with something that, in order to describe a new concept, you can go back and find something they're familiar with and then relate this new concept to something that they're already familiar with to help them understand things. Okay, process analysis is the next one. A methodical breakdown or deconstruction of how something works and its vital components. So that's another mode of discourse. Breaking down something as common as how an engine works. You open up the hood of a car and you look at all the different parts and you say, here's this part of the engine, and here's where the combustion process starts, and here's all the mechanisms that cause that to all come into play. You can do that with something physical like a motor, but you could also do it with something a little more abstract, like how our government works, the process of making a bill into a law. So if you've seen the Schoolhouse Rock videos and you've seen the bill sitting on Capitol Hill, that's what the process analysis is all about. It's explaining how a process works, or how an object works, or a system works. Example or illustration, again, this is a little bit like description. You probably are not going to have an entire piece that is entirely example or illustration, but this would probably be a tool that would be used within one of those other pieces of or larger pieces of writing. An analogy or extended metaphor. So again, like I said before, when you're using description, you want to describe things in terms of something that other people are familiar with. And so we have these, and sometimes we use these so much that we don't even realize we're using them. But an analogy or extended metaphor to introduce the reader to a new object, a new concept, or a new idea by relating it to one that is more familiar or common. All right, let's move along here. Classification, organizing objects, people, or ideas into categories, hierarchies, sets and subsets. And you're probably familiar with, from your biology classes, the kingdom, phylum, class, origin, species, genus, and I probably got those mixed up, but you know what I'm talking about. A common classification system, a way of making sense of things. And in this case, again, it's sort of like classification is sort of like a series of concentric circles, or those Venn diagrams you worked with probably in middle school in math class. You can do the very same thing as an organizational structure with your writing. And when you're analyzing the writing of professional authors, you are also sort of looking at how they may be classifying different bits of information. All right, let's take a look at compare and contrast, showing the similarities and differences. The comparison would be the similarities, the contrast would be the differences among two or more objects or concepts. This is often useful to relate subjects that are often confused with one another. And so one of the best ways to use comparison and contrast, or the best circumstances in which to use comparison and contrast, is if you're describing things that are often confused with one another. So if, say, one of the examples that comes up in my classes a lot is, I know I usually have students who are involved on the school dance team, and I also have students who are involved in cheerleading. And these people get pretty irritated at people who don't know the difference between the two. And so something they might do as an exercise in compare and contrast is to say, okay, here's what the dance team does. Here's what the cheerleading team does. Oh, and by the way, there's more than one cheerleading team. There's a competitive cheerleading team and a non-competitive. There's one for football. There's one for basketball. And so you're giving new information to people who might be confusing those two concepts. Oh, and by the way, the cheerleading team and the dance team sometimes get together and collaborate on different things. So you can see how it's easy for people to get confused with those things. Now, that's a pretty simple example, but when we take a look at other concepts that are one is often confused for the other, you can really fine-tune those arguments by using compare and contrast and breaking down what one thing does, what another thing does, how they overlap, how they intersect, and then how they're different from one another. Cause and effect. This is a really basic one. The common means of establishing reason or factors that contribute to an outcome. And one of the things that I will sort of caution people about with cause and effect, it seems like such a simple concept. A happened, and therefore B was the result of A. All right, well, that makes sense, but I want us to be a little more specific about how we approach that. A caused B to happen, but to what extent? Is A the only reason why B occurred, or are there other factors? And also we get into some sort of logical concepts and logical fallacies, which some of you may have studied. Faulty cause and effect. Just because something happened prior to something else does not necessarily mean that it caused it to happen. Washing your car before it rains, it might seem like every time you wash your car it rains, but there's no cause and effect there. So sometimes people like to establish a cause and effect where there really is none. And there are some things that are factors in something that occurred later on. It did contribute to the effect, but it didn't necessarily cause it because there were so many other variables involved. And if you're involved in science, you know what I'm talking about. You have to, scientific methodology means that you have to control your variables. You have to, if there's something contaminating your sample, then you can't really establish cause and effect. You have to really control the research environment, and that sort of thing happens with language too. All right, then we take a look at, finally, argumentation or persuasion, which is a lot of what we're going to be working with this semester. Employing a variety of means to alter the thoughts, perceptions, beliefs, feelings, and actions of the target audience. And the thoughts, the perceptions, the beliefs, the feelings should ultimately end up with changing the actions. We want people to do something, not just to think in a certain way, not just to change the way they believe, but to actually do something based on what you've been studying. And with the Declaration of Independence, what is the purpose of the Declaration of Independence? The Patrick Henry's speech. He's trying to get his audience to agree that they need to break away from the British colonies. He wants them to take action, not just to feel a certain way about them, but to actually do something. With Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, he's not just trying to get his audience to think differently and to feel differently, but to actually do something to improve the lives of African Americans who the deck was stacked against, the laws were stacked against them, common beliefs were stacked against them. So he wants people to actually change what they're doing. And that's really what argumentation and persuasion is all about. There are multiple strategies for doing those sorts of things. And that's what we're going to be focusing on this semester. Let's move on here to the small units of discourse. And these are some words that we're going to be focusing on, and I'll expect you to know what they mean and to be able to use them in your analysis. Diction is one of those things. Word choice. We have lots of different words to choose from. And one of the things that we want to do is move beyond that sort of elementary mentality of, when people say, well, I like this person because he just tells it like it is. Well, there's really no such thing as just telling it like it is. People who deliver messages, they choose their words, and they don't just, good rhetoricians don't just tell it like it is. To me, tell it like it is means they haven't really given a lot of thought into how their message is going to be received by an audience. They haven't really thought about the connotations or the emotional impact of particular words. And because you've been doing this your entire lives with asking for something, asking nicely as opposed to demanding something, using words that are, have positive connotations that show that you're a good person. You have good intentions. You're not just somebody who's out to get what he or she wants. Smaller units of discourse involve figures of speech, and in this case, we're talking about again, metaphors and similes and personification and hyperbole, and all kinds of different things that are other than literal. Okay, so figures of speech are anything that is not literal, and keep in mind that literal means the words mean exactly what they say. So when you hear people, and this is one of my pet peeves lately, is when people punctuate their sentences with literally this, literally that. And probably 90% of the time when they say the word literally, they actually mean it figuratively. So they're saying the opposite of what they mean. So we have to be really careful about our using our language in that sense. But figures of speech, those can be used effectively. Sometimes they can, if people get out of hand with them, they get a little too crazy, they can actually obscure the meaning that you're trying to get across. Tone, you know what that is because that's the very same thing that you've been studying in literature. But tone, what we want to do is make sure that we're not just limiting tone to a couple of different things. So, positive and negative, happy or sad. There are lots and lots of different words we can use to convey tone, and we want to be specific about those. How is this person happy? Is this person excited? Is this person anxious? Is this person anticipating something? Is this person content? So there are lots and lots of different ways to say happy or sad without just limiting ourselves to those two tone words. And keep in mind that tone can also change, and very often does change throughout a piece of literature. So we want to trace the changes in tone throughout a piece. The sentence structure and length, that has a pretty profound impact on the way an audience will perceive what you're trying to say. Sentence structure and length. Do we want to vary our sentence structure and length? Well, that's usually a pretty good way to get people to not be lulled into a rhythm that's going to put people to sleep. But sometimes a well-placed short sentence, a very short sentence, maybe even 2 or 3 words, can almost serve like a punctuation mark. And we're going to take a look at different ways in which professional authors have used sentence structure and sentence length to convey a message, to create specific effects, and we're going to talk about those effects. All right, connotation, really important. You probably learned that around your sophomore year or so. Connotation and denotation. Denotation is the actual literal meaning of a word. Connotation is the feelings that are associated with the particular word. We have lots and lots of different ways to describe the very same object, but how you, the words that you choose, and of course that ties in with diction as well. Choosing those words and choosing the appropriate emotional level to elicit a particular response. Again, we want to get used to using that in our own writing, but we also want to be able to analyze it in other people's writings and see the different ways in which that's used effectively. All right, levels of specificity and abstraction. That's a mouthful. But being specific, there is one thing that I've said year after year after years. I'm going to get a rubber stamp that says be specific, be specific, be specific, because a lot of times, one of the classic pitfalls of high school writing is that people tend to write very generally. They'll say something in a very abstract way, and it could mean a lot of things. It could mean so many things that it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean anything because it could mean anything, if that makes any sense. So we want to take a look at when authors and speakers get very specific about things, and when they sort of rise on the ladder of abstraction to sort of gloss over a point, or maybe it's not really important that we dwell on a particular point, so we'll just throw out an abstract word. And it's important to note that the more abstract a word or a phrase is, the more open it is to interpretation. And so if you listen to political speeches, you'll notice that good rhetoricians will sometimes sort of rise on the ladder of abstraction when they don't want to commit to something, when they don't want to make a specific promise that will come back to haunt them a little bit later on. Abstraction is also usually depends more on emotion rather than facts, and the more specific something is, the more factual it becomes. So if we can get used to thinking about the levels of specificity and abstraction of different terms, we can write and communicate much more effectively. All right, let's move on. We're almost finished here. Repetition. We know that that's a rhetorical strategy. Repeating something gives it emphasis, reminding your readers, your listeners, of a particular concept in lots of different ways. So it could be the repetition of ideas, it could be the repetition of a specific word. And we know from reading pieces like Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, from listening to John F. Kennedy's speeches, listening even to the speeches of Adolf Hitler. He was really good at repeating the same thing over and over and over. And one of the sad realities of repetition, if you've studied a little bit about the rhetoric of Hitler, one of his famous phrases is that the more he repeats something, the more people will believe that it's true, even if it's an absolute lie. If this lie is repeated over and over and over and over, people will begin to believe it. And so his audience, certain people started to believe what he was saying. Then they started repeating it, and then it just sort of took on a life of its own. And then this thing that wasn't true at all sort of festered into a reality that didn't really exist. So we have to be really careful about repetition. It can be used in lots of different ways. Emphasis and de-emphasis, that's sometimes noted, described as emphasis and downplay. So what ideas are we trying to emphasize? What ideas are we just sort of mentioning and glossing over and moving on? We want to take a look at different ways that authors will sometimes de-emphasize something or sort of mention something in passing and just sort of move on without going into a lot of detail about it. And that's one of the ways in which rhetoricians will sometimes give us ideas that, again, sort of politicians like to do this. They'll mention something, but almost downplay it. And I'll give you an example. It's if you had three students, and the teacher says to Johnny, "Hey Johnny, you did a great job on this paper. Man, this is one of the best papers I've seen in the last 5 years." And then Susie, "Wow, your paper's really fantastic. My goodness, look at the way you've done," and gets really involved in all the details, and then looks at Jimmy and says, "Hey Jimmy, you did a pretty good job on your paper," and then move on. Well, is Jimmy going to be offended by the fact that this person said he did a good job on his paper? I mean, hey, I gave you a compliment, right? But in that rhetorical context, in that physical context of the tremendous emphasis that person put on the other two, we know what happens here, right? Jimmy is offended, even though the words literally mean something positive. So we have to be really careful about that sort of thing. And we know that people who are sort of have passive aggressive personalities, they know how to do this, right? And you've probably seen this. You probably know people who are pretty good at that. Complexity and simplicity. That's a stylistic tendency. Sometimes people like to get very complex in their style, complex in their diction, complex with the words that they use. And it's not necessarily a good idea to use a lot of big words, a lot of complex words, a lot of complex sentence structures, and a lot of times sort of one of the common beliefs among people, college freshmen, upper level high school students, is the more complex they are, the better their writing is going to be. Not necessarily the case. Sometimes simplicity does the job much better. Ernest Hemingway, his writing style is super simple. Does that make the quality of his writing any less? Of course not. So we're going to take a look at some of the different ways in which authors use complexity and simplicity to get their ideas across. Strategic omission. Again, what a person doesn't say as opposed to what he or she does say is very important. And sometimes we have to think about, as we're analyzing the different pieces of literature or different essays and things, what could this person have been talking about, or what am I anticipating this person to say? And then, oh, wait a minute, the person either says nothing about it or says very little about it. And so you can create an effect. It almost works in the same way as de-emphasis, just leaving something out in particular. Let's move on to rhetorical devices. And those are kind of like, and the classic example is when John F. Kennedy says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So taking a phrase, and I believe that one's called chiasmus, taking some of the words or taking the first part of the phrase and then sort of flip-flopping it and using the same words but using it in a different sense at the tail end of the phrase. Martin Luther King, whatever happens to one directly affects all indirectly, and I'm loosely paraphrasing, but that's a good example of rhetorical devices. So sometimes words that have, or phrases that have a specific kind of a ring to them like that can be rhetorical devices, and they help things stick in our minds. Rhetorical devices can also be rhyme, alliteration, starting words and phrases with the same initial consonant sound. So rhetorical devices, as opposed to rhetorical strategies, are very often seen as sort of sound devices, the way a phrase sounds. Transitions, that's pretty self-explanatory. So transitions are often thought of as just a way to move from one idea to another. But let me get a little more specific with transitions. When I think of transitions, I think of them as words that show how one idea relates to another idea. So it's not just a way to connect ideas, but a way to show the relationships among those ideas. And those relationships, a lot of it we already talked about. Is it cause and effect? Is it one is a smaller part to a greater whole? There are lots of different ways in which ideas relate to each other. So That's what I mean by transition. Lists. Lists work often in the same way as repetition. Listing things, naming things. If you studied Walt Whitman during your junior year, you know that Walt Whitman was pretty famous for creating lots of lists. He called it cataloging. Naming things and sort of creating a rhythm with those lists. That's, again, a bit of a rhetorical device. Parallelism. And we know that there are forms of parallelism. We know that there's a grammatical parallelism. Items in a list need to be in the same form, the same grammatical form. So there's grammatical parallelism. And then there's rhetorical parallelism. And that means giving a list of ideas equal weight, making sure that they're sort of named in the same in the same list, and therefore sort of showing the relationships among the ideas by placing them strategically near each other. And I'm going to add one here. I've already mentioned this one here, but a particular type of parallelism, juxtaposition, is a pretty important one, and that is the strategic location of an idea next to another idea for the purpose of contrasting, or for the purpose of showing a comparison, for the purpose of sort of setting things side by side next to each other so that the reader can sort of see the relationship from one thing to another. And words and phrases, paragraphs can be juxtaposed. But just a sort of physical example, you might see a picture of a person standing by himself, and then you see another person who's a foot taller standing next to that person. Your perception of the first person changes because that taller person stepped up. And so you might think, well, this person's just average height. You really have no idea what this person, what their height is, until you see somebody else for the purpose of contrast. People's everything is relative, I think, is a really good way to explain the concept of juxtaposition. So anyway, that's a good start for where we are. I know that's a lot. It's a handful. I'm going to send you those on Google Classroom, and that's sort of the basis of what we're going to be taking a look at when it comes to analyzing our articles and those sorts of things this semester. So I hope you all have a great day. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to talking to you later. Bye-bye.